Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so we've been examining the Culavedalla Sutta. This is Sutta number 44, and in the middle-length discourses, this starts on page 396. Okay, so in the previous class, we dealt with the nature of what is called Sakkaya, that's identity, which is the 5 aggregates, the collection of the 5 aggregates, and then with the relationship between the 5 aggregates of clinging and clinging itself. Okay, so that takes us through about halfway down on page 397, and now we come to the important topic of what is called identity view. In Pali, this is called Sakkaya Ditti. So this is a particular kind of view or perspective regarding Sakkaya. Okay, so Sakkaya are the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. So what are the 5 aggregates? We can't call on the person who knows the name of the wives of the Asuras. Somebody else. Okay. Oh, reading from a book? No.
Form, feeling,
Yeah.
perception,
Yeah.
mental formations, and consciousness.
Okay. So it's material form, feeling, perception, the mental formations of emotional activities, and consciousness. And so identity view is a kind of view regarding these 5 aggregates. And it's particularly the view, in a general way we can express it as the view which identifies one or another of the 5 aggregates as being oneself, or which in some way holds to the idea of a self existing in relation to the 5 aggregates. That's the more general way to characterize identity view. But the text is going to explain it in a somewhat more detailed or more elaborate way. So we can look at the text. So remember, this is a dialogue between the bhikkhuni Dhammadinnā and her former husband, who is the lay follower Visākha. So Visākha asks, Lady, or Venerable Lady, how does identity view come to be? And then Dhammadinnā explains, here, an untaught ordinary person, or we might say an uninstructed worldly person, who has no regard for the noble ones and is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, that is in their teaching, who has no regard for the true men, or maybe more generally the true persons or good persons, the saintly persons, again it means the noble ones, and who is unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma, regards material form as self, or self as possessed of material form. Or in other words, self is the owner of material form. Or material form as existing inside the self, or the self as existing inside material form. And similarly, he regards feeling as the self, he regards perception as the self, he regards the mental formations as the self, he regards consciousness as the self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as existing in the self, or the self as existing in consciousness. So what identity view eventually turns out to be 20 kinds, 20 views, 20 possible views regarding the 5 aggregates. And so we have 5 aggregates, and each of these aggregates can be regarded in one of 4 ways. We can put this in a kind of algebraic form. Let's say X is the particular aggregate. And so for any aggregate, there's 4 possibilities. Some of these might seem a little bit strange to us, but probably in India during the Buddha's time there were a lot of different schools of philosophy, religious thought beginning to evolve, which presented different ideas about the self. And they tried to find different ways to establish a relationship between what they believed to be the self and the visible, concrete, individual personality or individual being. So, like the simplest way to go about establishing the idea or view of self is to identify myself is X, myself is bodily form, myself is feeling, myself is perception, myself is volitional activities, myself is consciousness. And last week I spoke about how, again, I qualify this saying that this is my personal interpretation. It doesn't come from any authorized Buddhist text. But it seems that people with different characters, different interests, will incline to identify with one or another of the five aggregates. So the beauty queen or the sports, the muscle man, they will identify more with the body, form as the self. A person with very refined aesthetic temperament, or somebody who likes to wallow in feelings and emotions, will identify self with feeling. Somebody who is maybe an artist, or can be even a computer programmer who likes to work with ideas, concepts, systems of ideas, might identify perception as the self. The person of action, a business executive, politician, military man, they would be the type who identify with volitions as the self. And then the thinker, the philosopher, or maybe the mystic will identify with consciousness as the self. So that's the simplest level, is to identify one or another of the aggregates as the self. But another way of thinking about the self is to see the self as something standing apart from the five aggregates, and then to conceive of the self as being that which possesses or owns the aggregates. So we can see how this is reflected in our ordinary language. We say, this is my body. And so ordinarily we don't inquire into the implications of that idea. We just take it for granted. It's somewhat, something that just works, and the background of the mind is a tacit assumption, kind of underlying presupposition. So we're always thinking, my body. After you wake up in the morning, if you look in the mirror, you have to make sure everything looks beautiful, right? Even we monks, we have to think, my whisker is getting too long, do I have to shave? We think, do I have my robe on properly? So this is my body. But usually we don't formulate it in that way, but it just remains there and quietly in the background of the mind. If we go to the doctor and he says, oh, your cardiogram shows defective heart. Oh, then the idea of grasping at my body comes very clearly to the surface. Oh, I have a weak heart. Oh, am I going to live? Am I going to die? Do I need a heart transplant? Oh, your liver is failing. Again, it's my liver, my body. And so when there's some kind of affliction that attacks the body, then we can see the idea, myself as the owner of the body becomes explicit, rises to the surface. And similarly, if somebody speaks a little bit rudely or impolitely to us, we think, or we might say to them, oh, you hurt my feelings. So here we're identifying with feelings. So the idea that I own, or actually we're identifying as the owner of the feelings. He hurt my feelings. So if you don't apologize to me, I'm not going to speak to you anymore. So my feelings have been hurt. Or else if we touch like a hot stove, we get ill with flu, then we're really feeling miserable, then we think, these are my feelings. Again, if we have some idea, like in a classroom, teacher calls on you and you present some idea, and then the teacher or other students reject that idea, we say, that is my perception which is being rejected. And so here the identification or the taking of the perceptions or ideas to be oneself, taking oneself to be the owner of the perceptions, this is becoming explicit. That if one makes a proposal for a project, for a way of doing things, a project for organizing a committee, a project for promoting Buddhism, okay, and then somebody rejects that proposal, then we could see my volition, my will, my purpose, my intention is being rejected. Okay, so these are different ways in which the idea of taking things to be mine comes to the surface. Okay, the third proposition, X existing in the self, this is more philosophical, and this seems to be rather not so common in the West, but it was rather becoming widespread idea in India during the time of the Buddha, that the self is something vast, immeasurable, universal, and everything in the world exists within the self. So this is a view that's often expressed in a collection of texts called the Upanishads, one of the important texts, the foundations of Indian thought. And so the fundamental idea of the Upanishads is that the real self, our real self, is a imperceptible, invisible, all-embracing universal reality, and that the whole world exists within the self. And so everything in the world passes away and vanishes, but the self always remains eternal, unchanging, immutable. And so here we have everything, including the five aggregates, existing in the self. And then the fourth idea, it's an idea that, again, we might not formulate very explicitly, but sometimes if we reflect, we have the idea that there must be something inside me, behind all the activities of the senses, behind my experiences of feeling, something which is the feeler of feelings, the perceiver of perceptions, the doer of actions, the knower, that which is even behind consciousness. And so we take the self to be existing inside the five aggregates, to be the inner nucleus or inner substance of a person. So it's like peeling away, I'm trying to think of a fruit, or maybe it's like cutting through a peach, and then inside the peach one finds the pit. And so the pit, you could say, is the essence of the peach.
Would you say this is akin to the idea of the soul?
Yeah, it's actually very, that's a good point. It's very much like the idea maybe in Christianity or in other forms of theism of the individual soul as something existing within us. In fact, also in Hinduism, one has the idea of the self as something existing deep within, behind all the layers of body and mind. So they speak also in the Upanishads of 5 sheets or coverings of the self. There's physical or bodily covering, the covering of prana or vital energy, the covering of mano, which is mind, mental activity, intellect, the covering of vijnana, which is knowing or consciousness. And then there's a fifth sheath, which is called the sheath of bliss, Ananda Kosha, Anandamaya Kosha, the blissful sheath. And then behind or within the blissful sheath is the Atman, the eternal self. Okay, and so the Buddha speaks about these as views which are held by the uninstructed, ordinary person, one who has not seen and realized the Dharma. And this factor of, this factor of identity view becomes extremely important in the Buddhist system of teaching. For what reasons? Very important reason. Yeah.
Because of his sort of revolutionary concept of anatta?
Of course that's important too, but there's specifically the Sakkaya Ditthi or identity view plays a key role in the Buddha's teaching.
I think it's releasing of each view to the eventual nothingness.
To the eventual.
Of the impermanence, the nothingness, going to nothingness. Releasing each view, each form, each perception, concept, state of consciousness, releasing it.
Yeah, of course that's important too, but what I have in mind is a specific formulation. We've come across it, I think, in the earlier class.
What was the question again?
What is the specific role, why does this identity view or Sakkaya Ditthi play such an important role in the Buddha's teaching? You can answer.
I can't think of any strict formulation. I mean, yes, it is to be released, the views are in thicket, and it leads one down into self. But I think you're looking for a more formulated response from the earlier discourse, aren't you?
Yeah.
It's not coming to me.
Okay, then I have to give it myself. Maybe I didn't formulate the question.
Give it hint.
Okay, I'll mention 10. 10 things. Okay, maybe I have to give the answer. Do you know the 10 fetters? Yeah. The text speak about 10 fetters. These are the 10 things that bind a person to the cycle of birth and death. And then the first of these to be broken is Sakkaya Ditthi, the identity view. It's actually part of the first 3 that are broken together. But I would say that for this reason, identity view, Sakkaya Ditthi becomes like it's the major cognitive barrier, the barrier to the understanding of the Dharma. And so the Buddha's, so they said, the revolutionary view of non-self, of selflessness, is the antidote for removing identity view. Okay, so now there's one question that came from the internet. Person asked, in my example of attachment to the aggregate, who or what becomes attached to the aggregate? Okay, this is an important question. And actually, the question says who or what. And if we take who to be what is attaching, then we're holding to a view of self of some kind. We're taking that there's a self which is attached to the aggregate. But according to the Buddha's teaching, there's no self which is attached to the aggregate, but there is just this attachment or clinging to the five aggregates. And that clinging to the five aggregates is included within one of the five aggregates. It's in the aggregate of volitional formations, or volitional activities. So clinging is a particular mental disposition or mental factor, and this clinging, this clinging is what becomes attached to body or form, feeling, perception, volitional activities, and consciousness. And so because of that clinging, there appears to the mind the idea that I am a self, or I have a self. And then if we speculate about the five aggregates, then we think that the self exists within the five aggregates, owning the five aggregates, and so on. But there's no actual self that stands outside the five aggregates and becomes attached to them. It's just that the clinging gives rise to this delusion or appearance of a self.
How does the notion of self come to be? I mean, we're talking about it as if it already exists in everybody. But clearly, perhaps in an infant, there is no sense of self.
In the infant.
In the infant. And so what happens
Yeah.
that leads...
Okay, this is an interesting question. Yeah. And actually that point about the infant not having the view of self is dealt with, or at least it's touched on, in one of the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is in number 64. Yes, on page 537. In paragraph 3, one monk that the Buddha calls on expresses a certain view about the five fetters, five lower fetters, mentioning identity view as one of the lower fetters taught by the Blessed One. Then the Buddha says that somebody from the outside could try to refute you with a simile of the infant. For a young, tender infant lying prone, lying on its back, does not even have the notion identity, the notion of any kind of person. So how could identity view arise in him? That's the opponent's position. But the Buddha says, yet the underlying tendency to identity view lies within him. So that tendency is there. And sort of looking at it in terms of its origins, we could say that like the most basic factor that envelops the human mind is what the text calls ignorance or avijja, which means not seeing the true nature of things. And so this avijja is already present, in the infant, even though the infant can't have a view of self. But because ignorance is there, we could say that that view of self is lying latent or dormant within the infant. And so once the infant starts to mature and to become a person, then the ignorance, of course, is still there. And then that ignorance will get activated by different experiences, and then the view of self will start to crystallize. But I think one has to distinguish, I will distinguish two aspects of the idea of self that develops within a child, a developing child. One is probably, you're a psychologist, you correct me if I'm wrong. What I would call the ego not in a negative way, but is that factor which enables us to have a sense of our own personal identity in a positive way, and which enables us to mediate between our own needs and the world for meaningful relations with other people. Okay, so that would be the wholesome or strong sense of, I use the word ego, so it has negative connotations, but this would be maybe the sense of oneself as a person, as a true individual.
Ego doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation.
Excuse me?
Ego doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation.
Yeah, well, the way it's used in popular, maybe in the psychological literature it doesn't, but in popular usage, like people will say he has too much ego, or he's an egomaniac, or he's carried away by his own ego. So this would be like the negative side of the sense of self-identity. And so in ordinary people, both sides develop together, and to be a healthy person, the negative side of ego has to be kept sort of under control, and the positive side has to be strengthened and enhanced. But normally, in all individuals, except those who have reached some of the stages of enlightenment, there's some idea of oneself as having this self, which one then either identifies with some aspect of the body-mind complex, or else one views as existing behind or within the body-mind complex. And then that becomes the basis for clinging to the sense of what I truly am. And then for the Buddha, that is like one of the root causes of dukkha, of suffering. Okay, any further questions on this? Okay, then, in fact, the way the question is posed here, I have to say, in the beginning of paragraph 7, the way it's translated, lady, how does identity view come to be? It doesn't really answer the question from the standpoint of origins, but it seems more as though the question should be interpreted, what is identity view? In fact, the Pali is ambiguous, a little ambiguous. I think it's kattam sakayaditti hoti, so which could be interpreted, or king sakayaditti hoti. Either what is personality view, or what is identity view, or how does identity view come to be. But this really just explains what is identity view. Okay, then we come to paragraph 8 of section 8. This is just the inverse. How does identity view not come to be, or what is the absence of identity view? And then Dhammadinnā replies that here the well-taught or the instructed noble disciple who is regarded for the noble ones and is skilled and disciplined in their teaching, who has regard for the true persons or the saintly persons and is skilled and disciplined in their teaching, does not regard material form as self, or self as possessed of material form, or material form as in self, or self as in material form, and so on through each of the other aggregates. So this is how identity view does not come to be. And actually, maybe we could raise a more specific question, how is identity view overcome or eliminated? And this is what takes place through the development of vipassana, or insight. And so through the practice of meditation, even in the early stage, what one does is to objectify each aspect of one's experience simply by noting it, by labeling it, by letting it go. And so normally when a thought arises, we implicitly identify with that thought, and then we let that thought flow in and give rise to other thoughts, and then we build up whole reams of stories based on the sequencing of thoughts, interwoven with feelings, ideas, plans, desires, memories, and all of this, these different strands or threads get woven together to make up the fabric of our individual identity. And so through the practice of insight meditation, through what applies mindfulness and clear comprehension to whatever arises, simply notes it and lets it go. So feelings arise, one will just note the feeling, let it go. Ideas will arise, one notes them, lets them go. Plans, memories, desires, projects arise. Again, one notes them, lets them go. And then one could turn even to what I would call the light of awareness itself, and just observe that light of awareness. And so in this way, one is step by step disidentifying with each of these factors of our experience. And by objectifying it, labeling it, one steps back from it and doesn't get carried away by it. Then as one goes on observing in this way, one begins to see what I would call the flow or flux-like nature of experience. That what we call experience is not the experience of a lasting subject, a lasting entity, but it's a constant succession of occasions of feeling, perception, willing, and knowing, all based upon a physical body, which is also in a process of change. And so through this kind of mindful self-observation, one comes to recognize the mark of impermanence, that all of the factors of experience arise and pass away, arise and pass away. And then as one is seeing them arise and pass away, then one is beginning to get a clear perception of impermanence, anicca. And as the concentration and mindfulness grows stronger, this perception of impermanence penetrates through to deeper and deeper levels, or subtler and subtler levels, until one is able to see the impermanence of the bodily processes, even at what one might call a molecular or atomic level. It doesn't mean that one is actually perceiving atoms, but the speed at which things are arising and passing away intensifies so much that it seems even within a second one is able to observe dozens or even hundreds of events that arising and passing away. And similarly with the mind, the mental activity, when one turns the focus of attention on the mental activity, one sees what seem to be dozens or even hundreds of acts of mind arising and passing away moment by moment. And so one is getting a very clear perception of impermanence, and then from that perception of impermanence, when it carries deep enough, then one can start turning and seeing how whatever is impermanent cannot be myself. And so everything one is observing is arising and passing away. And so one gives up the identification of it as myself. And then one might think, well, even though whatever I'm observing is myself, but the observer is not myself. Whatever I am observing is not myself, but the observer is myself. So behind all of the changing experience, there seems to be some kind of lasting light of awareness, and that is the self. But what one then does is to, what I call it, bend the light of attention back upon the awareness itself. And then one sees how the awareness is also always arising and passing away. And so one keeps on doing this with each level of reflective awareness. And so one sees both sides of the experience, the objective portion and the subjective portion, arising and passing, arising and passing. And because they're both arising and passing, then one cannot take them as self. So eventually, as one develops this insight into the selfless nature of the aggregates, instead that one reaches a certain point where one fully penetrates through all the selfless nature of all conditioned phenomena, and then momentarily realizes the unconditioned, which doesn't arise, that which doesn't arise and pass away. And when one makes that breakthrough, that's called the breakthrough to the truth of the Dhamma, then the idea of self falls away completely. And at that point, the fetter of identity view is broken. Okay, any questions on this portion of the sutta? Okay, this is the question: is it possible for the mind, let's say for a person, to have sexual desire or ill will if one has totally eliminated the view of self? Yes, that is possible, because the view of self, it's a kind of cognitive idea. And so the person who breaks through the view of self completely, or eliminates the view of self completely, is what we call the stream enterer. This is the person who's reached the first stage of awakening, the first stage of enlightenment. But this person hasn't yet eliminated all of the mental fetters or afflictions. And so even a person who's a stream enterer, or even at the next level, the once returner, can still have sensual desire and ill will. Though of course they'll be weaker than that in an undeveloped person. But it's only at the third of the four stages of enlightenment that sensual desire and ill will are eliminated. Okay, this gets a little complicated. I often hear people say the Buddha actually never said that there isn't a self. He only said to see things is not self. Can you comment on this? Yes, this is actually true. It's actually true. The Buddha doesn't say explicitly there is no self. Since in a way to say there is no self is to set up something like a theoretical position. So the Buddha always takes a very practical approach. At least this is the way I understand him. What he says is to contemplate or to observe all phenomena as non-self. So the root of the problem is that we identify things as being I and mine. And usually what we identify as being I or mine are the five aggregates. And so the Buddha's way of instruction is to point out that the five aggregates are not the self and not the belongings of the self. And so see, contemplate the five aggregates as not mine, not I, not myself. So that's what I would call the practical approach of the Buddha. Okay. would the Buddhist mind-only school, or the school of Buddha nature, have the view that all existence, I see the third position, that X exists in the self. The self-nature generates all existence is in the Platform Sutra, that is the Sutra of Huineng. It seems to me that all schools of Buddhism that I know of reject the view of self. Though sometimes the language in the mind-only school can seem a little bit similar to that of the language in Upanishads or Vedanta. But at least explicitly they are committed to the idea that all phenomena are non-self. I'm in no way an expert on this particular school, so I can't comment authoritatively on it. Okay, please.
I have a question, a general question.
Yeah.
And you're referring, as you said, to the cognitive view of self.
Yeah.
The arising of the cognitive view, as you brought up babies. But speaking as a mother who is present at the birth of the baby, it seems to be the case that there is a primal view of self that exists right from the moment of birth.
You mean in the infant?
In the infant, in human beings. And what I've observed, and to quote the D.W. Winnicott, for example, that a mother's job is to bear the rage of the infant. There's a rage for life and a grasping at life that appears with the first breath. And it is, in a sense, there only seem to be selfless when everything is going your way.
So it's non-cognitive, so it's not really like an explicit view of self. But what I would say is that the tendency to the idea of I is there, and so if it's frustrated or countered in any way, then it gets activated.
And this grasping is very, very fierce right from the start. Speaking as the object of that grasping.
I guess it depends on the child. Maybe there are some infants who are very calm. Maybe an infant who's been a yogi in a previous life. There's stories that I've read about how maybe these are people who become saints later in life, and they come out, all the relatives standing around are very astonished at how calm and tranquil the baby is. Nothing seems to disturb the baby. Okay. Did you have a comment, David? Maybe take the microphone.
I was just thinking that in order to get to the point of accepting a kind of non-self, one would have to be much older. It's a kind of complex notion, because I think the more natural state is to experience self. One would not be able to experience a non-self until one had developed cognitively enough to make that kind of separation. So you couldn't really have anybody until, let's say, the middle of their adolescence begin to deal with it, if even at that point. Adolescents are very self-involved.
Well, I think by middle of adolescence, already the idea of self is, especially in America, pretty solidly established. Maybe not in a reflective way, but certainly in a way that's in an operative way. I was going to say something, and it just came in. I think it was relating to the idea of the idea of the cognitive self. it doesn't necessarily mean that the person has kind of philosophical view of the self. It's actually sort of sitting down at his desk with paper, a notebook, and a pen, and writing. When I reflect deeply in myself, I can see how I'm not the body, I'm not the feeling, I'm not the perceptions, but certainly that which knows, that which thinks, that must be the self. Not necessarily in that case, but it just means that the idea of a self is formed to the extent that one tends to identify explicitly in one's thinking with things, in one's day-to-day interactions with other people and the world. And then the other point that I wanted to bring up when you were speaking about the need to have an idea of self in order to overcome it, that there are two ways in which you could say people have an undeveloped idea of self, or maybe two ways in which people can operate without a developed idea of self. One is people who have an underdeveloped idea of self. These would be people who are maybe subject to maybe to schizophrenia or to, what are some of the other conditions?
But it can be very retarded or intellectually developed.
Yeah, but there are people who could even be well developed intellectually, not mentally retarded, but there's still not a complete, healthy unification or solidification of the personality. And so for that person, a person like that, it's usually said that this type of Buddhist philosophy of non-self or meditation on non-self is not recommended. Because what that person has to do is to overcome this dissolution, to overcome this ununified aspect of the personality, this multiple personality or unsolidified aspect of personality, and consolidate it more in order to develop a healthy sense of self. Okay, so in order to reach, to be able to cultivate the insight into non-self, one first needs a healthy and well-developed sense of self. And then when one overcomes the idea of the atta, the self spoken of in Buddhism, then one becomes free from self in the healthy or wholesome way. I saw a hand floating. Neil? Take
the previous one of the questions from online got me thinking. If the Buddha actually never said there is no self,
yeah,
but instead encouraged one not to see the aggregates as self,
yeah.
Is it possible that he meant to say these are not self, but something else is?
No, because he also repeatedly rejects somebody's attempt to posit a self outside or beyond the aggregates. I think what I would say is that one can infer from things that the Buddha said that he doesn't accept the idea of a metaphysical self at all. I think Andrea wants to say something.
Thanks for bringing that up, because there's a whole internet debate, just raging debate on it, and you have people who are hysterical, really hysterical in their arguments, and they use that to even further posit the idea of self by saying, well, he never said that.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to really clarify that, so thanks, Neil.
Yeah,
That's really important.
I keep away from internet debates on
No, but this is going to get on the internet. That's important, and I wanted you to go over that a bit further, because I could just be, well, they can understand it.
Yeah, wow.
And everybody
I have to
knows
be extremely careful of everything I say here.
Well, no, but then you come up with a rejoinder, because, they just go nutters over that. So, ergo, ipso facto, there must be a soul or an atma. Next is the great rebirth debate, but that's not for this.
microphone. So, pass it down.
I think I saw a Sutta which talks about a person asks the Buddha if there is a self.
Yeah.
And the Buddha gave him the answer. And the Sutta about it.
And the Buddha gave him the answer.
They gave him the answer like, I forgot where I saw it, but it's like, he taught everything like 5 aggregates. How can you still think there's a self? It's something like that. I'm not sure.
Oh, maybe.
I think so, something like that.
I'm not sure. I have to think which. I have to see which sutta that is. But there is a sutta where one wanderer comes to the Buddha. His name is Vajjagota, and he asks the Buddha, "Is there a self, Master Gotama?" And then the Buddha remains silent. Then Vajjagota says, "Is it the case then that there is no self?" And again the Buddha remains silent. Then this wanderer walks away, and then Ananda asked the Buddha, "Why did you remain silent in both cases?" Then the Buddha said that, maybe this is what you're thinking of, if I said that there is a self, would that be consistent with my teaching that all phenomena are non-self? So then Ananda says, that's the case, it would have been inconsistent. And then the Buddha says, if I taught that there is no self, then this wanderer is already very confused, and so he would have wondered, before I had a self, and now the teacher Gotama says I have no self.
Yeah, I saw that Sutta too.
So is that the one you were thinking of?
I don't think they are the same one.
Okay, I'll try to think of the one.
I'll figure it out.
Okay.
Is she thinking of the fisherman one?
That doesn't really speak so much about the 5 aggregates. That's more to reject the idea that it's the same self that wanders on from life to life.
If I could just make a comment, I just think a lot of this debate of, oh my God, it's not really even a proper question to ask if there's a self, because it just further enforces the idea of self. It's besides the point of the Buddhism.
Yeah.
Trying to teach.
Yeah.
To get people totally away, because now you're seeking to just attach onto an idea of self. We'll see. Yeah.
Either an idea of self, or else there'll be those who militantly take up the idea there is no self.
And either way, because they don't get it, but they're either being eternalists or nihilists. They're actually because you either think there is a self, or you think there is, something to be got rid of. Either way, you're putting in something, and that's totally against the point of the Buddhist concept.
So it seems to me the Buddha, his teaching is designed to eliminate, it's actually clinging to things as being I, mine, and myself. And so what is it that we cling to? Basically the 5 aggregates are also external things. So the Buddha says, see all dhammas, all phenomena.
Our condition.
Excuse me?
Our condition.
Yeah. So see all phenomena, either the 5 aggregates or external things, see them as not mine, not I, not myself. And when one develops that insight, it removes the clinging. And so that's the cure that the Buddha is aiming at, is the removal of the clinging.
But I think one of the problems, especially in Western countries, they don't really teach by the Socratic method anymore. Do you know what I'm saying? We want to be spoon-fed. We want to be told what is. He didn't teach that way. He taught in a negative fashion to get people to think for themselves. And that's the problem, because especially in Western culture, well, what is it? What's the answer? He didn't teach like that.
Yeah, that's true. Somebody, I think Neil has a question.
Yeah, I was just going to add that.
Take the microphone.
I was just going to add that there was an implication in how you answered that question that I think was important, which is that the Buddha didn't treat it philosophically. there is or is not a self. You treated it very practically.
Exactly.
And I have a teacher who always says, just sit on the cushion and as you look at the 5 aggregates, see if you can find a self. If you can, let me know. And so basically that's what he's doing. He's just, telling us to see for ourselves if we can look inside of this being and find that perfect self.
Okay, take the microphone.
I know next to nothing about all of this because I'm just a very beginner. But I'm wondering if all of this is somehow, it sounds to me anyway, probably my misperception, this all begins to sound very metaphorical. Even the idea of self sounds as if he's talking about something in some metaphorical kind of way rather than some literal kind of way. I mean, we're talking about all of this in a very literal sense. There is a self, like he was talking about a self. Perhaps he was talking about something somewhat different. I don't know what that would be, but it doesn't sound as as if it's something that's literal, that exists in the way that he was talking about it.
Well,
I'm not making myself clear.
Unless you...
I mean, there is a self, there isn't a self. It goes back and forth.
Well, that is the sort of the questions, or one of the questions that was discussed and debated amongst all of the thinkers and religious teachers in the Buddha's time. And then the Buddha spoke about this whole debate that there is a self, there isn't a self. He calls it like the wilderness of views, the desert of views, the thicket of views. But the idea, for people who have the idea of self, including those on the internet who say there is no self, you idiot.
Well, David Hume also agreed that there wasn't any experience of self. So if I examine my own experience, what I see is bundles of ideas at 2 different types. One external, large, clear, forceful ones, and faint, imaginary, memory ones, right? And they said, but you don't experience a self. But that means that the self is not experienced. That's not quite the same thing as saying that the self doesn't exist. Because you can say, okay, so what the self is the thing that does the experiencing. In other words, right? That is that you don't have to say, well, I experience or I don't experience the thing that does the experiencing. That you don't have to make that decision. There are some things which we acknowledge exist without experiencing them. In the way, for instance, like mathematics and such, like the rules of logic. You don't have to think that you're going to experience a rule of logic in order to be forced logically to acknowledge that it exists. And so the problem there is, I think, the idea of existence. That is, the assumption is that that existence is only something which one experiences. And so, you don't always use that idea of existence. Right? That is, there are contexts in which you don't. For instance, in logic and mathematics and different areas of philosophy. And so what we're saying is the Buddha is not necessarily claiming either that self exists or that it doesn't exist. What he seems to be claiming, or closest to claiming, is that it's not experienced. That's a little different from the claim that it doesn't exist, given that existence has a number of different meanings.
And that's a good point. In fact, there's a statement that's in Sutta number 22. This is about as close as one can find to a denial of the self in the Buddha's teaching. When it's not phrased in terms of existence, but in terms of what is found or apprehended. Let me see if I can get the page. Okay, this is on page 232. It's Sutta number 22, paragraph number 25. Okay, the Buddha is speaking to a monk, and he says, or to the monks, and he says, because there being a self, would there be for me what belongs to a self? In other words, if there is a self, then there's something which belongs to a self. That would be if I posit a self, and we could say the 5 aggregates belong to the self, or external things literally belong to the self. Okay, so the monk says yes. Then the Buddha says, or else, if there is what belongs to a self, then would there be for me a self? So yes. So in other words, self and what belongs to a self are interdependent notions. Then he says, since a self and what belongs to a self are not apprehended or not found as true and established, then the standpoint for views, namely that which is the self is the world, after death I shall be permanent, everlasting, eternal, and so on, doesn't that become an utterly and completely foolish teaching? Okay, so the point that I want to make here is that the Buddha doesn't quite say that since a self and what belongs to a self doesn't exist, he just puts aside the question of existence, and he says that a self and what belongs to a self are not apprehended, they're not discovered, not found as true and established. So then that becomes a reason for putting aside all views of self. Okay.
Sorry, I just want to ask one more question.
Yeah.
Very often, we talk about somebody, very often a good person, as being selfless.
Okay.
What does that mean in reference to, in regard to what the Buddha is talking about?
Okay, we speak about a person in ordinary language as being selfless.
Yes.
I would say that in the case that that person has a very attenuated sense of the ego self in the negative sense, that the person is willing to do things for the sake of others, very helpful, very generous, self-sacrificing. We would say this person has a very highly developed sense of empathy with others. And so what I would say is that a person like that, who has a character like that, would have a very strong basis for developing the insight into selflessness. So it doesn't necessarily mean that such a person has already reached that insight. But it's, say, they're working along on parallel lines, the parallel lines that could meet at a certain point in the future. And then, of course, if a person overcomes the sense of self through insight, then that person will be spontaneously selfless in their behavior. Okay, I just want to take the last internet question, then we'll disband for lunchtime. Okay, the question says, some part of karma is very hard to explain without some sort of carrier, something to carry the karma. Yeah, this was a question, in fact, that the Buddhist schools face, because the Buddha doesn't deal with that question explicitly. Oh, I see, this is a continuation. Is there a carrier of karma? Is the carrier a permanent entity? What is the nature of this carrier from life to life? Let me just say that different Buddhist schools began to speculate over this question. What is it that carries the karma? And probably the dominant view is that there's no entity that carries the karma from moment to moment and from life to life. But there's a kind of stream or sequence of momentary acts of consciousness And the stream of karma is just like a collection of potentials within that stream of consciousness, which is passed on from moment to moment within the stream of consciousness. Then when the right conditions come together, then the karma brings its results. But there's no entity which is the carrier of the karma. But other schools weren't satisfied with that and some posited a kind of consciousness. It's called the Alaya Vijnana, which is, again, it's a stream rather than a lasting entity, but it's a stream that continues on preserving its identity from life to life, and it carries the seeds of karma. Okay, this is just a continuation of the question. Okay, I think we'll end now, and we will have a class again next Saturday, the 29th, and we'll try to finish the Sutta next week. I thought to myself this morning, well, I should be able to finish the Sutta today. But I think it's important to discuss the questions that arise from this passage. Okay, we'll end with the sharing of the merits. So we share the merits of listening to the Dhamma, teaching the Dhamma. We share them with the Devas, Bhutas or fair spirits, and other sentient beings. Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahisika Punyantam Anumodipa Chirang Rakantu Desanam. Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahisika Punyantam Anumodipa Chirang Rakantu Desanam. Akasata Chabhumata Deva Naga Mahisika Punyantam Anumodipa Chirang Rakantu Manparam. Etavata Chamhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavata Chamhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Bhudanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Ekavata Chamhehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Sadanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhagapadaya Vichihitato Etantare Satakai Papana Rupya Rupicha Sanya Sanino Tukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Vibhukti. Please stand up.